We live in a pretty incredible world. We've got medical advances that would have seemed like magic a century ago, massive economic growth. We're connected to people on the other side of the globe. In so many ways, life has never, ever been better. So here's the big puzzle. If everything's so great, why does it feel like we're in the middle of a massive mental health crisis?
It really is a tale of two worlds, isn't it? On one side, you have all this amazing progress. But then you look at the other side, at our actual well-being, and it seems to be going in the complete opposite direction. We're seeing more anxiety, more social isolation, even a spike in chronic diseases. So what is going on here? Let's dive into this paradox.
So in this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to investigate this modern paradox. We're going to explore the pretty surprising and honestly kind of controversial idea that the very environment we've so carefully built for ourselves might be the thing that's making us sick.
But okay, first things first. Before we can figure out the why, we have to start with the most basic question of all. Is this real? Is this feeling of a crisis actually backed up by the data? Are we really dealing with an epidemic of sadness, or does it just feel that way sometimes?
So are we actually more depressed than our parents' or grandparents' generations? It seems like it should be a simple question, right? But it's surprisingly tricky to get a straight answer. Researchers have been wrestling with this for a while, and, well, the data can be a bit messy.
So here's how they try to figure it out. There are two main approaches. First, you've got retrospective studies, where they basically just ask people, hey, do you remember being depressed in the past? These studies tend to show that, yeah, younger generations seem to be at a higher risk, but there's a huge catch. Our memories are, well, they're not perfect. It's a classic problem called recall bias. That's why the second kind of study, longitudinal studies, are so important. They follow the same group of people over many, many years. They're way less biased. And what do they find? Over and over, they mostly confirm it. Depression really does seem to be on the rise.
And just look at this major U.S. study for a concrete example. Between the early 90s and the early 2000s, that's just one decade, the rate of major depression more than doubled. It jumped from around 3% to over 7%. That's not just a small bump. That is a massive shift in a really short amount of time.
So, the verdict? Look, the data isn't perfect, and you can always find studies that disagree. But when you step back and look at the whole picture, the weight of the evidence points pretty clearly in one direction. We are in the middle of a real and growing mental health challenge.
Okay, so if the problem is real, that brings us to the million-dollar question. Why? Why is this happening? Well, one of the most powerful theories out there, one that could explain almost everything we're seeing, is called the evolutionary mismatch hypothesis.
Now, to get this, we have to think way, way back. The whole idea is based on something called the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or the EEA for short. Now, this isn't a specific place or a single point in time. It's more like the collection of ancestral environments that our bodies and brains are literally built for, a world where we were always moving, eating whole foods, and living in these super tight-knit social groups. And this is where the mismatch just smacks you in the face. Our diet, it's gone from whole foods to processed, sugary stuff. Our activity level, we went from constant motion to sitting in a chair all day. Our sleep, we've traded natural light cycles for chronic sleep deprivation and blue light from screens. We swapped daily sunlight for life indoors, and our tight-knit tribe for sprawling but often kind of shallow digital networks. I mean, in almost every single way that matters for our biology, the world we live in today is radically different from the one we evolved in. All right, let's break this mismatch down a little more. Let's start by looking at the physical culprits, all the ways our modern lifestyle is putting our bodies and, as a result, our brains totally under siege. First up, let's talk about our food. The typical Western diet is, well, it can be a real recipe for trouble. It's packed with sugar and refined carbs that send our blood sugar on a roller coaster, and it's often seriously lacking in crucial stuff like omega-3 fatty acids. Those are the healthy fats that our brain absolutely needs to function properly and to keep inflammation in check. And then there's the huge cost of just sitting still. Our ancestors were almost always on the move. But today, fewer than half of adults in the US get the recommended amount of physical activity. And think about this. We have study after study showing that for some people, exercise can be just as effective as antidepressants. And yet, we have systematically engineered movement right out of our day-to-day lives. And we absolutely cannot forget about sleep. Back in the 1960s, the average American adult was getting about 8 hours of sleep a night. Pretty good, right? Well, today, that number has plummeted to just 6.7 hours. We are literally in a state of collective sleep debt. And the science on this is crystal clear. When you're chronically sleep deprived, it messes with your hormones, it tanks your mood, and it can actually double your risk of developing depression. But this mismatch, it isn't just physical. It goes way deeper. It's also deeply, deeply social. So now let's turn to our fraying social fabric and see how the huge changes in our social world are hitting our minds. A lot of researchers use this phrase, a socially toxic environment. And what they mean is a world where we're seeing more and more individual competition, where loneliness and isolation are on the rise, where there's this growing sense of social threat and, running underneath all of it, this deepening economic inequality that's just reshaping everything. Now, while all of those factors absolutely play a role, there's one that really stands out in the research. It has a super strong, really consistent link to poor mental health, and that's income inequality. A huge meta-analysis, this is where they combine the data from a bunch of different studies, 12 in this case, found a really powerful connection. It turns out that people living in countries with higher income inequality have a nearly 20% greater risk of depression than people living in more equal societies. This isn't just a vague idea, it's a real, quantifiable risk. So how in the world does something as abstract as inequality actually get under our skin and into our heads? This part is fascinating. The research points to a few different pathways. At a national level, more inequality often leads to less investment in things that help everyone, like healthcare and education. At the neighborhood level, it can chew away at social trust and ramp up what they call status anxiety, that constant stressful feeling of comparing yourself to others. And finally, for us as individuals, it can lead to chronic psychological stress and this powerful feeling researchers call social defeat, that painful, persistent sense that you're being left behind. Okay, so we've kind of diagnosed the problem, right? We've seen how both our physical world and our social world are seriously mismatched with what we actually need to be well. But understanding the problem is just the first step. The real question is, what's the path forward? This isn't exactly a new idea. More than 70 years ago, Albert Einstein was writing about the big crisis of his own time, and he pointed out that our social drives were deteriorating. He believed that the only real way to find meaning in life was to devote yourself to society. It's a pretty powerful reminder that our own personal well-being is completely tied up with our connection to other people. And this all brings us to a really crucial conclusion. The evidence is pushing us to think about depression in a much broader way. It's not just a chemical imbalance happening inside one person's brain. It can also be seen as a perfectly logical, maybe even predictable, response to living in a deeply imbalanced and mismatched environment. So, what does a path forward actually look like? Well, it seems like we have to work on multiple levels at once. On an individual level, yeah, we can all try to prioritize those basic health behaviors our bodies are crying out for. Better food, more movement, more sleep. But let's be real. Systemic problems need systemic solutions, and that means bigger things, like redesigning our cities to encourage walking and human connection, using economic policy to tackle inequality, and actively, intentionally, finding ways to build real community again. And this really leaves us with one final and kind of provocative question. We have built an environment that so often puts things like consumption and convenience way ahead of our actual well-being. So if our modern environment is a huge part of the problem, then the real question we have to ask ourselves is this: what part of modern are we actually willing to change to get our well-being back?